But you have to think, though, what about your ancillary departments? What about the OR attached? So I was like, I don't know where I got to take him. I got to take him down outside to the hallway, down to the frat shack. Where do we got to go?
What if one conversation could save a life? What if one new process or new product could save a patient from surgical harm? Broadcasting from a hospital basement near you, you are listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the global voice of sterile processing. Each week we spotlight the best practices, products and people from around the world who are disrupting our profession and helping you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Join us as we have the kinds of conversation that matter and give our industry the kind of voice that it deserves. Nyt on aika mennä puhdastakin puhtaammaksi. And now it's time to go beyond clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we're speaking with Sean Weir, SPD educator at UPMC, and we're going to be talking about ethylene oxide sterilization. And you might have thought it was a thing of the past, but it's not. It's still here. And there's lots of different avenues in which ETO is used, but we're going to be talking about it really for the front lines today, Hank.
ET Phone O. Got creative with this title, Justin, to try to pull in folks, because it's kind of next generation technology / 1980s, because it's been around, but it's not around in the same way that it has been for decades past. So, kind of crossing those generational boundaries, if you will. But that was the vision for this episode. And I know that Sean's not going to disappoint.
All right. We're going to be right back with Sean after a short break. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, joining us now is Sean Weir, SPD educator at UPMC and president of the Western PA ISHM, now HSPA chapter. And Sean, really excited to have you on the show today. Welcome to Beyond Clean.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you tell us something about yourself? And I'm going to go totally off the rails here. I'm not even going to ask you to tell us something about yourself related to sterile processing, maybe something outside of the industry that you're interested in. I know you're actually recording this on a gaming computer, but we're not necessarily going there, I don't think.
No, I'm actually not into gaming. I'm into cigars and bourbon.
Well, I think we all have something in common there. Not just the fact that we're all located in Pennsylvania, but cigars and bourbon sound good. So we have to meet somewhere in the middle, maybe in that State College kind of range or something like that. And we'll have to share a nice glass of bourbon and a cigar.
Maybe we can do that.
So, all right, now I will ask you to tell everybody a little bit about your background in the industry. And I know you've been the chapter president of that Western PA chapter for quite some time now.
Yeah, so I've been in the industry for about 13 years now. I've been in every role from tech, lead tech, supervisor, manager of a department, a level 1 trauma hospital. Now I am an educator of a hospital currently.
Excellent. And so today we're going to be talking about ETO, or ethylene oxide. And we've put out a decent amount of content around this topic over the last several years here at Beyond Clean. And we have definitely interviewed some people such as Ted May about ethylene oxide and its application. And we've also interviewed folks like ChemDAC who do chemical monitoring. And this conversation's come up in this season of chemicals here on Beyond Clean. We want to talk to somebody on the front lines about this and sort of maybe industry trending. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how much experience you've had related to reprocessing utilizing ethylene oxide?
I have been using ETO for almost 10 of my 13 years in sterile processing. I've had it in 3 of my 5 facilities I've worked in.
Sean, one of the reasons that we brought you on for this episode is because when I first heard you say that here recently and talking about how much experience you had, I was a little shocked because I've met a lot of folks in the industry that have kind of had my trajectory in that we've just never been exposed to ETO. All we've ever heard of ETO or experienced ETO is, yeah, that room over there is where we used to do ETO. Or there's like, stories from old timers that were like, yeah, like, back in the day, this is the process for that, but now we don't do that anymore. So I really wanted you to come on the show to maybe push back that assumption that I had that ETO is kind of not present in the industry or not as present in the industry, but like your career, as you just explained, is predominantly ETO based, right? Is that common in your area of the country, or did you just happen to be in the right departments? Like, do you have any insight around that?
So I'm not really sure on why there's so many ETO machines around the Pittsburgh area, but I know that there's at least 6 organizations that have ETO. Then they use it 3 to 4 loads a day. Some facilities only have 1 machine, some have 2, some have 4.
So give us some insight into what you're sterilizing or what those departments are sterilizing who are utilizing ETO.
Currently, right now, where I'm working at, they are using it for scopes to be terminally sterilized. And then some other pieces that can't be done in steam or low temp. They're not validated for it. Some other hospitals are using EO for clinical based, like cadaver labs, things that can't be cleared to be sterilized in steam or low temp that might pass. But mostly it is now GI scopes.
Okay, right. So in your role as an educator, obviously you're going to be that first touch for a lot of new technicians coming into the department, through either certification training they may have had or even some schooling prep before they take their first role. They're probably going to be introduced to ETO, but definitely not to the level of actually needing to use it and understand the workflow. So I'm wondering if you can give us a little insight into how you approach that gap. I'm going to call it a gap. I don't know. Maybe you won't agree with that, but just kind of the industry prep that's out there. Do you feel like folks who are coming in to ETO for the first time have sufficient education around it, or are you having to kind of serve as that first teacher for these new technicians?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword on that one, Hank, because if I get new hires or transfers from other hospitals that never used EO, you have to kind of teach them the basic foundations of what EO is and how it is not harmful to your health unless, the canister explodes or it gets punctured. But the chance of that happening is very, very, very slim in our settings. And then the new techs, just like teaching them steam or low temp, as I call it, not STERRAD, it's kind of just setting the foundations of, yes, it can be harmful to your health. Yes, it is harmful to women who may be carrying a child, but the chances of an exposure is so slim with the proper airflow, proper monitoring devices, handling the cartridges, them storing in the right flammable container. So in my 10 years, I've never had 1 ounce of fear of using EO.
You laid out a couple things that I want to dig into here. The first of which, you kind of made a side comment, but I've heard you say this in the past in different settings, and I really want you to say it on the podcast. What's your beef with how folks in the industry use low temp or, STERRAD to kind of describe low temp in general, but you are very intentional about separating those categories. Can you talk about that just real briefly?
So yes, EO and low temp, it is a low temp, I should say. However, EO is, gas. When you say STERRAD, everyone assumes STERRAD as being hydrogen peroxide vaporized, but it's really not. Because STERRAD is a brand of a company. It is made by ASP. It's ASP STERRAD. We all know it. It's the, the workhorse of the older days. Now you have, the ozone out. You have the V-Pro Max Plus, out. And hospitals really need to change the way they word STERRAD. And in addition, the manufacturers of the products, and when they do the validation testing, they need to look at too. It says STERRAD compatible. but it doesn't say VPRO or the ozone modalities. So for me, it's breaking that barrier of the past where everyone said, "Oh, it's all sterile." No, it's all low temp vaporized hydrogen peroxide. Like that's my beef with it.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the Google, that has become a phrase or like a verb, but it's an internet search that you can do in different places besides Google, right? So
yeah,
you can sterilize in a low temperature setting in different ways besides, to your point, like one particular model or brand. So that's a point well taken. I actually agree with it, but I wanted you to set it up.
I've changed numerous people's minds on it, so I'm gonna keep on it.
Good. I appreciate that. Now, you also brought up another piece of this that obviously is a huge topic in the industry, whether or not you've had experience with it, but it is that perception of safety and our lack of safety, depending on what side of that you fall on. And as Justin mentioned, we have a lot of content around that, from both sides, from the manufacturer side, from EO, from the safety kind of monitoring side. And then, here you are in the middle as kind of a user and educator saying, hey, if everything's working appropriately and if you're monitoring appropriately, it's just as safe of a chemical as any other chemical that's being used and monitored appropriately. Am I describing that right, or am I missing something?
Dead on. I mean, I've seen more staff members burned by the chemistry in decontam when they're gowned up and it's soaking through their PPE. Unfortunately, they're getting third-degree burns from that chemistry. I've seen that more in my career than I ever have with the EO exposure. I mean, if you have the proper, air pressure in the room, or it's in the flammable cabinet, you have the door seals, everything's set in place, your EO monitors is, PM'd accordingly, there should not be any fear for running gas.
I do want to go back to that competency point that you kind of alluded to, like a lot of different things that would be listed on a traditional competency for EO. Is there anything else that you would want to kind of spotlight? Again, speaking to educators who may be new to their role or new to EO in their facility, who are kind of looking at their department saying, okay, what do I definitely need to have in my competency check around this process? Like, what are those key things that you would definitely want to highlight?
PPE. As simple as it sounds. Going back to low temp hydrogen peroxide, I'd love to know how many people actually wear gloves when they're taking out the finalized load in the biological. Just like with EO gas, you're supposed to have on a face shield and gloves when removing any loads from the sterilizer. Yeah, it's aerated for 16 hours, but it's in the eye of you to wear the proper PPE. I would stress that to all new and current educators to push that onto your staff. Make that hard stop and say, hey, what are you missing? You're going to do it if they're in decontam, right? So why not take that step into sterilization?
As I was going to say, that's an applicable insight across the whole workflow.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever you are, if there's PPE required, you should be wearing it. But I totally hear you on that. On the clean side, in a sterile area, there seems to be less emphasis around that because we're not as concerned with transmission of microorganisms as we are to keep ourselves safe. But that's just as important, I think,
I agree.
To highlight there. So that's a great point. Policy procedure. So you've kind of alluded to this a little bit on the comparative, to hydrogen peroxide, but how should we be thinking in terms of the differences around how and what our EO policies and procedures look like versus hydrogen peroxide, and even into the workflow? Like, what are those big distinguishing marks about how we process EO devices versus how we process through hydrogen peroxide?
So for EO versus hydrogen peroxide, the one biggest thing is the cycle time. You're looking at around 16 to 18 hours for one cycle in EO versus, let's just call it a straight 30-minute cycle on hydrogen peroxide. The biologicals right now are still 4 hours, and now low temp is anywhere between 12 minutes, I think, or 15 minutes to 24 minutes. So that's another big thing that I wish that one company would kind of bring that 4 hour down to, I don't know, 1 hour, 2 hour.
So that's really the biggest challenge, right? The reason that you believe EO, because it's a lot less harsh on a lot of these medical devices, especially the ones that have multiple different materials, right? Or at least that's the claims that are out there, I guess, is maybe what I should say. But definitely over sterilization of scopes. When you talk about the rapid heating and cooling, that's, maybe not the other low temps, but definitely some of the scopes that are going through steam sterilization, ETO and low temp has far less of an impact on the actual materials that make up that scope. So do you think it's really the time factor that is keeping the adoption down, or do you think that there are other things related to ETO that, have caused it to be phased out and in much lesser use across the country?
I think it's more the states regulating the exhaust phase, we'll call it, of the EO and what's happening with that cycle and that part of the process. Look at California. I believe they've completely removed it. I don't know if Canada has or not, but I know there's some other parts of the world that have completely removed EO from all aspects. But if you look at it, it is really double high-level disinfecting. Your scope's really doing the job that EO could possibly do if the scope's cleaned properly.
Yeah, there's some really interesting studies out there on the effectiveness, especially as it relates to superbugs, and CRE being, a big one. So I'm going to summarize the two things you just said, which is if ETO in its current state could reduce the time that you have to wait, maybe down to half, preferably even a quarter of the time, and you could work on, state legislature, you think that maybe this would be utilized more widely across the country. Is that an accurate reflection of what you kind of just said to us?
I think you would see it more used across the globe, yeah. But I mean, you also got to look at too is could they reduce the, so what with us, where I'm working at currently, we have 4, and we have to strategically place loads in at set time frames throughout the day so they come out appropriately for the turnaround time for the other hospitals that we cater to. So like that's another big thing too. So you got to plan 18 hours in advance to return something back to another facility.
Do you only do that for the other facilities that are within your health system, or do you find that you're really kind of a central resource for your region that way?
No, we are for the organization. Within the organization, there's 3 or 4 hospitals that have EO, but amongst the area that we're located in, we facilitate, I think, 4 other hospitals.
Wow. So with all that in mind, where do you think the future of ethylene oxide is going? What's your gut telling you about where this technology is going? Is it continuing to phase out, or do you think it might make a comeback, or do you think it's going to kind of stay in a specific niche?
I think it's going to stay where it's at, with one major manufacturer pulling out of that game. We'll call it as such. And it is only based out of one company that I know of. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's very monopolized with one company. So I think it's just going to be very stagnant on the usage. I don't see any major uproar currently with the advance in technology that's coming out throughout our world. I feel within 10 to 15 years, it should decrease.
Like you feel like it will decrease naturally because of the pressures through legislation and emissions?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I do want to go back to something that you said about kind of that centralized resource, because I've heard that a number of times, and I know in the facilities, even though our facilities have not utilized EO, if you're close to a VA facility, oftentimes they are and do, and they kind of become your EO savior at certain points, because you come across these devices that, you've already described that are like, this is the best way. and there is no substitute. That's often kind of just random things that are potentially one-off that you're not going to use again for another 2 years, but you got to use it for this case. Is that an area that you've encountered around building policies or building memorandums of understanding, I think they're called, MOUs, for how your facility could serve as that resource? I know you said that your current one is just for the system, but have you had any involvement around kind of signing those agreements that, hey, if this rural clinic out there needs some help on an EO, that's something that we could support? How would you encourage folks to think through or talk through that?
So I have done that in my past. Currently, I'm not involved in that process. Actually, the VA is pretty close to my facility. It's right up the street. And when I did in the past, we worked through the transportation, the delivery, the time frame, again, and then the return process. It was a very lengthy discussion we had. It was probably every other week we met for 2-3 months until we worked through the whole process. We worked it out, and they only came once every 2 months. They dropped off when they were doing the remodel of their department, when they had their one-offs. It was very shortcoming on the time frame that they used this for.
Sean, I want to ask another question about resources, and we'll probably go another direction here in a second too. But because the technology is not the leading modality for sterilization, it's not steam and it's not hydrogen peroxide, what has your experience been around access to indicators, for instance, or access to some of those ancillary accessory technologies or products that you need to process these loads? Have you encountered any challenges, especially maybe during the COVID supply chain crisis? I know we've been seeing that in the world of Blue Wrap, for instance, and many other products. But is that anything that's kind of been especially squeezed during this?
The only thing I've heard of is the tape. The indicators and the biologicals, I have not heard any shortage of them. I think, again, going back to that monopolized one company owning pretty much all of the EO realm right now, I feel like they have to kind of have their stuff stored and ready to roll.
All right. So, Sean, you've had an enormous amount of experience with ETO, but so many people out there have not. And so as you speak to other educators who may not have as much experience, or maybe, as Hank mentioned earlier, transfer to a facility that does have it, where do you go for educational content, resources? Where are your go-tos as you put together any kind of educational material, or even updates if you need to make changes to policy or procedures as more information comes out?
That's a great question, because it's hard. Besides reading the IFU and the manufacturer's booklet on how to install the machine, it's very, very hard to find real data on EO studies. And that being said, I had to facilitate an EO mock drill. I think I reached out to you, Hank, on this, just to get some backing on it. I reached out to all my resources all over the place about the distance you would have to evacuate your department if you really, truly had an EO leak. And no one could tell me a distance. They said,
I think the answer is as far as you can go then. Yeah.
Don't stop.
In the absence of a defined perimeter, keep going.
But you have to think, though, what about your ancillary departments? What about the OR?
No, everybody's got to go. Yeah. Everybody's got to go.
So I was I don't know where I got to take him. I got to take him down outside to the hallway, down to the fry shack. Where do we got to go? So
nothing gets a COO on board your project to find the answer to that question faster than everybody keeps going until I find out.
But I mean, honestly, though, it goes back to just reading the book. I reached out to manufacturer. They put me through to the clinical educators. I reached out to other resources. Like I said, I reached out to Hank. I reached out to some other people in other states to see what they did. It was hard. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, Hank, you can feel free to give him my email address.
What do you think is, I think this has kind of been answered just based on what you said, but specifically, what kind of content would you like to see out there that would be helpful? I'm going to put, obviously, what's the evacuation distance right at the top of that list, but what other kinds of resources, content, or information do you think would be really helpful and is lacking additionally in the industry around ETO?
I would love to see more education on, maybe it's out there, I don't know, why a cycle is so long and why the aeration needs to be that long. Not many people understand why it has to be as such. Why it has to be 16 hours. What's the scientific backing behind that? Is there any proof that it has to be that long?
All right, Sean. Well, really good job with this interview. Anything you want to add before we wrap?
Nope. I'm still the world's fastest rapper, though. I'm going to call that out there.
Man, I knew that was going to come up.
Oh, I definitely want to see those Olympics.
Champion.
I can rap.
I need to come to the Olympics.
I can rap a tray in under 6 seconds.
Yeah.
No way.
Under 6 seconds, and aseptically done too.
Yeah, he's a legend. He's a legend.
They just downstaffed the department and said, "We don't want you as an educator.
I have a standing bet that's been going on since 2012. If you can beat me in a smartphone rap, done aseptically, OR ready, I'll give you $100 out of my pocket."
So
wow,
this is shaping up to be like the old John Henry kind of battle between John Henry and then the automatic. I don't know what it's called, like the
wood
automatic
splitter.
Driller. Yeah.
No, you're right.
It was
it's the pin.
It's the
pin.
railroad guy.
Yeah.
So if we ever get a good rapping robot over here in the U.S., Sean, it's gonna be your time is going to be near there. We'll see what's going to happen.
But I can't pay the robot,
a robot
though.
can do it in 6 seconds, dude. So,
seriously.
Nice.
All right, Sean, great job. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us, everybody.
That was Sean Weir, SPD educator at UPMC. And Hank, I think a lot of times, I'll say when I first got into sterile processing, there was a stretch of time where we were kind of like watching ETO phase out, and there would always be some customer that had equipment that was older equipment that was only validated for ETO, and they'd be scrambling to find somebody around town who still had ETO. And so today's conversation about, the future of ETO was super interesting, and Sean brings such great experience to the table.
It's a good reminder, Justin, that even though we feel like, if you don't use ETO anymore, you feel like, well, no one uses it anymore. But there's still a lot of facilities in the U.S. that are using it. And to your point, there's a lot of them that are kind of entertaining it again for all the reasons that we discussed on this interview. So if you are using it, or if you potentially could land somewhere that is using it, it's important to think through these educational topics that Sean brought up. And I thought he did a terrific job.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or just search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes, but you got to download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review while you're there, because your feedback is important to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.